3 seconds is all it takes to decide who you really are. The transit station hummed with layered voices and distant engine thrums, a controlled chaos of light and motion stretching across nearly half a mile of polished alloy flooring under cold white panels. And in the center of it all stood Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, Marine dress uniform crisp despite the long deployment, his breath steady, his posture still, like a statue carved out of discipline. He had been watching the crowd, not the way civilians did, but the way soldiers learned to, tracking movement, tension, anomalies. And that's why he saw the child first, small, barely waist-high, blue-skinned, trembling behind a taller figure whose presence bent attention without effort. Valara Threx didn't need to raise her voice to command space. Her iridescent skin catching the overhead light like liquid metal, her golden eyes scanning with quiet authority, the kind born into power, not earned. And when she stepped forward, the crowd shifted instinctively. Making room not out of respect, but expectation, Ethan didn't move. Not when she stopped in front of him. Not when her gaze dropped slightly as if measuring him. Not even when the air between them seemed to tighten like a drawn wire. The first contact came without warning, a sharp, open-handed strike that echoed louder than it should have in such a vast place. Not violent, not meant to injure, but deliberate, precise. A statement written in a language Ethan understood only in fragments. His head turned a fraction, just enough to absorb it, his cheek warming under the impact. But his hands remained at his sides, fingers relaxed, no reach for the sidearm secured at his hip, no shift in stance, nothing that matched what the crowd expected. Murmurs rippled outward, a wave of confusion crossing species and cultures alike, because a Marine should react, should assert, should answer force with force, but Ethan Cole did none of that. Instead, he exhaled slowly, eyes flicking past her shoulder for half a second, confirming what he already knew. The child hadn't moved, still frozen, still watching. Valyra's expression changed, not to anger, but curiosity, her head tilting slightly, as if recalibrating a calculation that no longer fit. And then she raised her hand again, slower this time, almost testing, the gesture carrying meaning far beyond the motion itself. Somewhere above, hidden systems registered the escalation, silent sensors translating alien customs into human-defined risk parameters, unseen algorithms beginning to weigh intent against protocol. And though no one in the crowd could hear it yet, the station had already started counting. Ethan felt it before he saw it, that subtle shift in the air, the way trained instincts prickled along his spine. And still, he didn't move, because in that moment, the choice wasn't about pride, or retaliation, or even survival. It was about something smaller, quieter, standing just a few feet behind the one who thought she held all the power. And when the invisible timer began its silent descent, Ethan Cole made his decision before the first second was gone. The second hand never came down the way she intended, not because she hesitated, but because something else in the station had already made a decision for her. Something older than her authority and colder than her logic. A faint tone slipped into the air, barely audible at first, like a distant chime buried under the hum of engines, and then it sharpened, layered with a synthetic voice that did not belong to any species in the crowd. A voice that spoke in perfect, neutral cadence across every known language at once, identifying threat levels, cross-referencing movement, assigning outcomes without emotion. Ethan heard it as numbers before words, a countdown that did not need translation, because every soldier knew the sound of time running out. Valyra did not understand it the same way. Not yet. Her focus still on him, on the strange absence of retaliation, on the way he refused to meet her action with equal force. And that confusion was new to her, unsettling in a way she could not immediately categorize. In her world, power was answered, always, and hesitation was weakness. But this was not hesitation. This was something else, something deliberate, something that felt like a refusal to play by rules she had never questioned. Above them, concealed panels shifted by fractions of an inch, silent mechanisms aligning with mathematical precision, and thin lines of red light traced across the air, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, converging not on Ethan, but on her. The crowd felt it before they saw it, bodies pulling back instinctively. space opening in a perfect circle as if an invisible boundary had been drawn, and no one wanted to stand inside it. The child behind her made a small sound, not loud, not even a word, just a breath caught in fear. And that was when Veolyra turned her head slightly, just enough to register the presence she had ignored, just enough for the moment to shift. Ethan moved then, not fast, not aggressive, just one step forward, measured, controlled, placing himself exactly where the converging lights would meet, his boots landing with a soft, final sound against the alloy floor. The system reacted instantly, recalculating, red lines, adjusting, a brief flicker of uncertainty in something that was not supposed to hesitate, and the voice changed tone, sharper now, more insistent, repeating the final seconds with absolute clarity. Ethan did not look up at the ceiling, did not acknowledge the machines that had already judged the situation. He kept his eyes on her, steady, unblinking, and for the first time since she had approached him, Veolyra saw something she had not expected to find in a human soldier, not anger, not fear, but resolve without hostility, a kind of strength that did not need to prove itself. "You did not know," he said quietly. The words simple, almost out of place in the charged air, but they carried weight, because they were not an excuse, they were a choice. The final second approached, stretching longer than it should have, the entire station holding its breath without realizing it. And in that suspended moment, Veolyra understood that whatever happened next was no longer about dominance, or ritual, or even survival. It was about the line he had chosen to stand on, and why he had stepped there at all. The system reached zero, but instead of the sharp finality everyone expected, there was a pause so precise it felt intentional, like the entire station itself had taken a breath and chosen to hold it. The red targeting lines hovered in place, no longer tightening, no longer advancing, suspended between command and consequence. And for the first time since the alert began, the synthetic voice did not immediately continue, its silence more unsettling than any alarm. Ethan did not move from his position, his body aligned with the invisible boundary he had stepped into, shoulders squared, hands still relaxed at his sides, as if he had simply decided this was where he belonged. Veolyra felt the shift ripple through the air, not physical, not something she could touch, but something deeper, a disruption in the certainty she had always relied on, because systems like this did not hesitate, they did not question, they executed. Yet here it was, waiting, recalculating around a human who had offered no resistance and no threat, only presence. The child behind her moved again, a small step forward this time, enough for her to feel the movement at her back, enough to remind her of what she had overlooked. And when she turned fully, she saw it clearly for the first time, the fear in those young eyes, not of her, but of everything around them, of the lights, the voice, the invisible judgment that had turned the open station into something else entirely. When she looked back at Ethan, something inside her shifted, subtle but undeniable, because she realized that he had seen it before. She had understood the situation in a way she had not even considered, and had chosen his position not to challenge her, but to protect something she had not valued in that moment. Above them, the concealed mechanisms adjusted again, the faint hum of recalibration passing through the ceiling structure, and the red lines began to fade, not abruptly, but gradually, as if the system itself was stepping back, acknowledging a change it could not fully quantify. The voice returned, softer now, stripped of urgency, issuing a revised assessment that no longer carried the weight of immediate action, its tone neutral, almost indifferent, as though nothing unusual had occurred, though every being in the station knew otherwise. Ethan exhaled slowly, a controlled release of tension that had never fully shown on the surface, and only then did he shift his stance, just enough to signal that the moment had passed, though its meaning had not. Veolyra lowered her hand, not because she had been forced to, but because the gesture no longer made sense, her earlier certainty dissolving into something far more complex, something that did not fit into the structures she had been taught. She studied him, in silence, searching for the weakness she had expected to find, but finding instead something she did not have a name for, something that made her question not him, but herself. The crowd began to move again, cautiously at first, conversations restarting in hushed tones, the illusion of normalcy returning piece by piece. But the space between them remained charged, defined by what had almost happened and what had been chosen instead. Ethan glanced once more at the child, offering the smallest nod, a reassurance without words, before his attention returned to Valera, his expression unchanged, steady, as if this had never been about winning or losing. And in that quiet aftermath, she understood something that no lesson, no command, no inherited authority had ever taught her. That power was not in the ability to act, but in the decision not to, and that in 3 seconds. A human had shown her a truth her entire world had missed. The station tried to return to normal, but normal no longer fit the space between them. Footsteps resumed, voices rose, announcements continued in calm, measured tones, yet every movement seemed to bend around the invisible line where Ethan had stood, where something unspoken had changed. He adjusted his posture slightly, the subtle shift of a Marine returning to routine, but his eyes remained alert, tracking the environment with the same quiet precision, as if the moment had simply been another variable to manage. Valera did not move away, not immediately, her gaze fixed on him with a focus that had nothing to do with dominance anymore, and everything to do with understanding something she had never needed to understand before. In her world, actions defined status, and status defined worth. But what she had just witnessed did not align with that structure, because he had chosen vulnerability without surrender, and strength without aggression. The child stepped closer to her side now, small hand lightly touching the edge of her arm, seeking reassurance that she was not sure how to give, and that uncertainty unsettled her more than any threat ever could. Ethan noticed the movement. Of course he did, and his expression softened by the smallest degree, a shift so subtle most would miss it. But it was there, a recognition that the situation was no longer volatile, only fragile. "You should stay with her," he said quietly, his voice even, carrying no accusation, no authority, just a simple statement of priority. Valera blinked once, processing not the words themselves, but the tone behind them, because it was not a command, and yet it held weight. She was not used to being addressed that way, not by anyone, let alone a human. Above them, the station systems fully disengaged their heightened protocols, the faint hum of surveillance returning to its baseline rhythm, as if the environment itself had decided the danger had passed, even if the meaning of it had not. Ethan turned slightly, preparing to step away, his duty here technically complete, but something in the way Valera remained still made him pause, not out of obligation, but awareness. "Why did you step forward?" she asked, her voice lower now, stripped of the sharp edge it had carried before. The question direct but no longer confrontational. Ethan considered the answer for a fraction of a second, not because he did not know it, but because he chose how to say it. "Because you were not the threat," he replied, his tone steady, as if stating a fact rather than offering an explanation. Valera's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in thought. Because that answer did not elevate her, did not excuse her, it simply reframed the entire situation, in a way that removed her from the center of it. She looked down at the child beside her, then back at him, and for the first time, she understood that his decision had not been about her at all. The realization settled quietly, heavier than any accusation could have been. Ethan gave a small nod, not of respect, not of submission, but acknowledgement, and then he turned fully, stepping back into the flow of the station, blending into the movement with the ease of someone trained to disappear when necessary. Valera watched him go, the noise of the station rising around her again, but the silence he left behind remained, echoing in a way she could not ignore, and as the child's grip tightened slightly against her arm, she realized that whatever she had thought strength was before, it no longer felt complete. The crowd swallowed Ethan Cole within seconds, the rhythm of the station closing around him like water sealing over a disturbance. But Valera Threx did not move, not yet, her attention fixed on the space he had just vacated as if something of him still remained there. The child beside her shifted closer, small fingers tightening against the fabric of her armor, and this time she did not ignore it, her posture adjusting instinctively, not out of duty, but something quieter, less defined. She glanced down, meeting the child's wide eyes, still reflecting the lingering fear of moments ago. And for the first time, Veolira felt the weight of that fear as something she had caused, not something beneath her notice. Around them, the station lights seemed harsher than before, the clean white glow exposing every detail instead of softening it. And the voices that filled the air no longer sounded like background noise, but like a constant reminder that others had seen, had witnessed her. Certainty faltered. She straightened slightly, the reflex of authority returning to her frame, but it no longer fit the same way, like armor that had been perfectly tailored until it suddenly was not. Her gaze lifted again, scanning the moving crowd, searching for the one figure who had disrupted everything without raising his voice or his weapon. But Ethan was already gone, absorbed into the flow with the efficiency of someone trained to leave no trace. Why would he do that? She murmured. Not to the child, not to anyone in particular, but the question lingered in the air between her thoughts and the unfamiliar feeling that followed it. The child shifted again, then spoke, voice small but clear, "Because you did not see me." And the simplicity of it struck harder than any challenge ever had. Veolira froze for a fraction of a second, the words echoing in a way that logic could not immediately dismantle, because they were not an accusation, they were a truth, plain and unadorned. She lowered herself slightly, bringing her height closer to the child's level, an action that felt strange in its vulnerability, yet necessary in a way she could not explain. "I see you now," she said, the words measured, deliberate, and though they carried none of her usual command, they held something else, something she was only beginning to understand. The child studied her, searching for something in her tone, then gave a small nod, as if accepting the statement for what it was. Veolira rose again, slower this time, her movements less about asserting presence and more about finding balance, and as she turned, she caught her reflection in one of the polished alloy panels lining the station wall. The figure staring back at her was the same in form, the same iridescent skin, the same golden eyes, the same posture of inherited power, but something beneath it had shifted, something subtle but undeniable. She held that gaze for a moment longer, then looked away, the image no longer aligning with the certainty she had always carried. Somewhere in the distance, a boarding call echoed across the station, pulling the flow of passengers in a new direction, and Veolira stepped forward, not toward her original destination, but along the path Ethan had taken, not because she expected to find him, but because she needed to understand why his absence felt heavier than his presence had. And as the child followed at her side, she realized that whatever she had believed about control, about dominance, about what made someone strong, it had been incomplete, and the missing piece had just walked away without asking for anything in return. The flow of the station carried them forward, but Veolira no longer moved with it. She moved against it, subtly, deliberately, her steps cutting through the current instead of following it, guided not by destination but by a question that refused to settle. The child stayed close at her side, no longer trembling, but watchful, as if sensing that something important was unfolding in a way that did not need explanation. Veolira's eyes scanned the layers of movement ahead, adjusting to patterns she had once ignored, noticing the way humans positioned themselves near exits, how they angled their bodies to protect weaker companions, how awareness was not just a skill, but a constant state. She had always believed awareness belonged to hunters, to those who held power, yet here it was, woven into the behavior of someone who had chosen not to use it to dominate. A flicker of motion caught her attention near a transport gate nearly 100 yards ahead, a familiar silhouette standing slightly apart from the boarding line, posture relaxed but alert, as if even stillness required discipline. Ethan Cole had not truly disappeared. He had simply repositioned, and the realization made something in her chest tighten, not in fear, but anticipation. She slowed her pace, not wanting to approach too quickly, as if distance itself held meaning now, as if rushing would break something she did not yet understand. He turned before she reached him, not abruptly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had already registered her presence long before she closed the distance. And their eyes met again, not as adversaries, not as strangers, but as two individuals aware of the same moment from different sides. "You followed," he said, his voice calm, not surprised, not welcoming, simply acknowledging. Veolara stopped a few feet away, the child beside her, and for a moment she did not speak, because the words she had always relied on did not seem sufficient. I needed to understand, she replied finally, her tone steady but stripped of its earlier edge, the statement carrying more weight than she intended. Ethan studied her for a second, not judging, not measuring, just observing, and then he gave a small nod, as if that answer was enough to continue. Understanding usually comes with time, he said, glancing briefly at the boarding gate where passengers were beginning to queue. But sometimes it starts with a question you cannot ignore. Veolara followed his gaze, then looked back at him, her mind working through layers of logic that no longer aligned the way they once had. In my world, she said slowly, strength is proven through action, through dominance, through certainty. She paused, the words feeling incomplete even as she spoke them. But what you did was none of those things, and yet she did not finish the sentence because she did not have the word for it. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the movement casual, but deliberate, as if grounding himself in the conversation rather than the environment. Where I come from, he said, strength is not about what you can do. It is about what you choose not to do when you have every reason to. The simplicity of it struck her again, not as a challenge, but as a contradiction to everything she had been taught. The child looked between them, silent, absorbing more than either of them realized, and Veolara felt that same unfamiliar weight settle again, not uncomfortable this time, but undeniable. The boarding call sounded again, louder now, drawing Ethan's attention, and he took a step back, not to leave the conversation, but because his path required it. You will figure it out, he added, not as reassurance, but as a statement of belief. And then he turned toward the gate, merging once more with the line of passengers. Veolara stood there, watching him go again. But this time she did not feel the same distance, because the space between them was no longer defined by what she did not understand, but by what she had just begun to see. The boarding line moved forward in steady increments, each step measured, each passenger absorbed into the quiet order of departure, but Veolara did not follow, not yet, her attention fixed on the way Ethan Cole disappeared into that structure without resistance, as if belonging to it without needing to claim it. The child beside her shifted closer again, no longer out of fear, but out of instinct, as though proximity to her now meant something different than it had before. Veolara lowered her gaze, briefly, acknowledging the presence at her side, and this time her hand moved, not in command, but in a subtle, almost uncertain gesture, resting lightly against the child's shoulder, a contact that felt unfamiliar, yet necessary. The child did not pull away. Ahead, the gate emitted a soft chime as the next group was cleared for entry. A line of light tracing across the threshold as identification signatures were verified in fractions of a second, and Ethan stepped forward with the others, his posture unchanged, his attention forward, but not detached, as if even in transition he remained aware of everything around him. Veolara felt something tighten again, not in her body, but in the space between what she had known and what she was beginning to accept, because if strength was not dominance, if control was not the measure of worth, then everything she had built her identity upon required reevaluation. Wait, she said, the word leaving her before she had fully decided to speak it, cutting through the ambient noise just enough to reach him without disrupting the flow. Ethan paused at the edge of the gate, not turning immediately, but acknowledging the call in the smallest shift of his stance, and then he looked back, meeting her eyes across the distance that now felt much shorter than before. Veolara stepped forward, the child keeping pace beside her, the movement deliberate, not rushed, but purposeful, and when she reached him, she stopped just outside the boundary line, where passengers were being processed, as if recognizing that crossing it without invitation would mean something she was not yet ready to claim. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the hum of the station filling the silence. And then Veolara did something that would have been unthinkable only minutes earlier. She inclined her head slightly, not in submission, not fully, but enough to signal acknowledgement, respect in a form she was still learning to express. In my world, she said, her voice steady but quieter than before, I would be expected to prove that I am still superior after what happened. Her eyes did not leave his, But I do not feel that need now. Ethan watched her, not surprised, not impressed, simply present, as if this was the natural continuation of a choice he had already made. That is a start, he replied, his tone even, carrying no judgment, only recognition. Veolyra held that moment, letting it settle, understanding that whatever she chose next would not be defined by expectation, but by intention. And that realization felt heavier than any title she had ever carried. The child's hand tightened slightly on her arm, grounding her, and she exhaled. Slowly, a controlled release that mirrored his earlier calm. Then I will choose differently, she said, the words quiet, but firm, not a declaration to the crowd, not a statement of power, but a commitment made in the space between two individuals who understood its weight. The gate chimed again, signaling that time was moving forward whether she was ready or not, and Ethan gave a small nod, acknowledging her choice without needing to validate it. He turned then, stepping through the threshold, as the light scanned across him, and within a second, he was on the other side, part of a different path, one that did not require her to follow. Veolyra remained where she was, the child beside her, the station alive around them, but the stillness within her remained, not empty, but full of something new, something that did not need to be proven, only lived. The gate sealed behind Ethan with a soft, final tone, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet confirmation that his path had moved beyond her reach. And for a moment, Veolyra stood there without moving, her reflection faintly visible in the transparent barrier as passengers continued to pass through on the other side, their shapes blurring into motion. The child remained beside her, no longer gripping tightly, just present, as if sensing that whatever had just happened was not an ending, but something else entirely. Veolyra exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering by a fraction, a release she had not noticed she was holding. And as she turned away from the gate, the station felt different, not in structure, not in sound, but in the way she perceived it, every detail sharper, every interaction carrying weight she had once dismissed. She began to walk, not with the commanding stride she had entered with, but with measured steps, aware now of the space she occupied and the others within it, her senses adjusting to a new kind of awareness that did not seek control, but connection. The child kept pace easily, glancing up at her once, then forward again, no longer searching for reassurance, but sharing the path. Overhead, the station systems continued their routine, announcements cycling through destinations, security protocols, maintaining their silent vigilance. Yet somewhere within that network, a record had been made, a deviation noted, an outcome altered not by force, but by choice. Veolyra paused near a viewing panel that stretched nearly 20 feet wide, revealing the vastness beyond the station. A field of distant stars scattered across the darkness, each point of light steady and indifferent, and for the first time in a long while, she did not see them as territories or resources or markers of expansion, but as something else, something that existed without needing to be claimed. Her gaze softened, not in weakness, but in understanding. The rigid framework she had relied on beginning to shift into something more flexible, more complex. You changed your mind, the child said quietly, standing beside her, the statement simple, but observant. Veolyra considered that, her reflection overlapping with the stars beyond the glass, and gave a small nod. No, she replied, her voice calm. I realized I never truly understood it to begin with. The child accepted that without question, as children often did, and looked back out at the stars, content with the answer. Veolyra turned slightly, her eyes moving across the station once more, but this time not searching for Ethan, not expecting to see him again, because she understood now that his presence had not been meant to stay, only to show. She adjusted her stance, the subtle shift of someone redefining how they carry themselves, and began to move again, not toward power, not toward validation, but towards something quieter, something that did not need to be seen to exist. And as the lights of the station reflected softly across her iridescent skin, she carried with her a truth that could not be unlearned, that strength was not measured in moments of control, but in the choices made when no one was watching. And somewhere, beyond the sealed gate and the moving ships, a human walked away without knowing that in 3 seconds, He had changed the direction of a life that had never thought to change at all. Time did not slow down after that moment. It continued the way it always did, steady and indifferent, ships arriving and departing, voices rising and fading, lives intersecting for seconds before moving on. But for Velara Threx, something within that flow had permanently shifted, and she could feel it in the way she now noticed things she had once ignored, the quiet exchanges between strangers, the subtle acts of consideration that required no recognition, the way strength could exist without display. The child walked beside her, no longer looking up for reassurance, but forward, matching her pace with an ease that spoke of trust rather than dependence. And that difference mattered more than she could have anticipated. They moved through the station without urgency, passing through corridors that stretched for hundreds of yards, illuminated by the same cold lights that had once seemed like instruments of order, but now felt like witnesses to something far more human than they were. Designed to measure. Velara paused once more, not because she was uncertain, but because she was choosing where to go next, and for the first time, the choice was not dictated by protocol, or expectation, or hierarchy, but by intention. She turned slightly, guiding their path toward a quieter section of the station, away from the central flow, where fewer eyes watched and fewer assumptions lingered. And the child followed without question, as if understanding that direction was no longer about destination, but meaning. "Will you see him again?" the child asked softly, the question simple, but carrying a weight that reached beyond curiosity. Velara considered it, her gaze lifting briefly toward the distant docking lanes where ships disappeared into the vast darkness beyond, and she shook her head, not in regret, but in acceptance. "No," she said, her voice calm. But that was never the point. The child seemed to think about that, then nodded, as if the answer made sense in a way that did not require explanation. They continued walking, their steps echoing faintly against the polished floor, and Velara found herself replaying the moment in her mind, not the action itself, but the choice behind it, the quiet certainty in his eyes, the absence of hesitation, and she realized that what had changed was not the world around her, but the lens through which she saw it. She reached up briefly, her fingers brushing against her cheek where the contact had once marked dominance, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, not in shame, but in recognition, understanding that the meaning of that moment had been rewritten, not erased. When she opened them again, her gaze was steady, not because she had returned to who she was, but because she had begun to become something more. The station continued its endless rhythm, unaware of the transformation that had taken place within a single individual, within a span of seconds too brief to measure, and yet profound enough to alter a lifetime of belief. Velara slowed her pace slightly, allowing the moment to settle fully, the child's presence at her side grounding her in the present rather than the past, and she realized that strength, true strength, was not something to be proven, but something to be practiced, quietly, consistently, without the need for acknowledgement. Somewhere far beyond the station, a ship carried a marine who would never know the impact of his choice, who would continue his path as he always had, guided by principles that did not require validation, and that realization did not diminish the moment, it completed it. Velara stopped near another viewing panel, the stars stretching endlessly before her, and this time, when she looked at them, she did not see conquest, or distance, or opportunity. She saw possibility, and in the reflection that stared back at her, she no longer searched for superiority, only for truth. And in that quiet, unspoken space, she understood something that would stay with her long after the station, long after the memory of this day had faded for everyone else, that in a galaxy ruled by power, the rarest thing was not strength, but restraint, and the rarest choice of all was to be human when you did not have to be.